Upon completion of the midterm course creation project for this course and review of literature from this and other courses in the EdTech program, I've compiled a set of beliefs that I have on the role of teaching and learning, with specific emphasis on distance or distributed education. While our text specifically defines a podcast as something very compartmentalized and time constricted to about 3 to 10 minutes on one specific topic, I am still using the audio podcast format. However, you could consider this more of an extended manifesto as opposed to a specific compartmentalized podcast. So for starters, I would like to reflect on the core of what is education. Well, this is loosely based on theoretical reading from both my graduate and undergraduate work. As a disclaimer, this is very much a personal statement, and these are things that I believe and have developed this belief since being an educator for about 10 years. So what is education to me? Well, I can break it down into two specific components. First, education has to do with acquisition or development. So what can be either acquired or developed? I've broken it down into three main areas. We can either acquire or develop knowledge, and that can be either theoretical knowledge, or it could potentially be application of knowledge, either applying it, which is a known, using a known process, or potentially generalizing information where we have known information and we're using it in an unknown situation. We could potentially be acquiring a skill, which is a specific process involving mechanics and a specific sequence of either events or tasks that need to be completed in order to gain an achieved end. Or we can educate ourselves for a specific perspective, for cultural awareness, disability awareness, or any sort of other contextual or awareness-based type of learning. So why do we learn? Well, we learn because we want to achieve a specific end, and to each of those three have specific ends. We acquire knowledge to gain theoretical proficiency. We want to understand something to a higher extent than we did before. We acquire a skill so that we can master it. That could be recreational, that could be for vocational, it could be parenting, it could be a functional skill, it could be any number of things. And we want to acquire perspective so that we can have a broader awareness of the context of the community and environment in which we live our lives. So when we talk about education, there are two key stakeholders in this. We have a teacher and we have a learner. So what is a learner and what are the characteristics of a learner? Well, it depends on the context of who specifically the learner is. We learn every day. From our very first days on Earth, we learn how to interact and we understand the context of our environment through our entirety of our adult life and even through the aging process. We learn new things all the time. So the scope of learners is extremely diverse, from infants to people on their deathbed. So in the context of my specific belief statement, the characteristics of my learners are adult learners. And as I have a master's degree before this program in adult education, I work in higher education. I work with adults primarily in my professional capacity. So I've chosen to use the context of adult learners because that is what I have the greatest perspective on, which is teaching adult learners. So specific to adult learners is this concept of andragogy, and teaching and learning happens to touch on the idea of andragogy. Adult ed spends a considerable amount of time on it, and we have Malcolm Knowles, which is basically the father of andragogic theory. And what he says is that adult learners have unique contexts to which they acquire and seek out educational opportunities, which makes them unique from pedagogy or youth learners. And I'd like to point out some specific and unique characteristics of adult learners right now. So the first thing is that adult learners are both highly motivated and more self-determined. Now, how can we rationalize that decision? Specifically for self-determination, children or students do not have very much self-determination when it comes to their willingness to access education. Up into a certain age, children are forced to engage in education, otherwise they're truant, and they can get in trouble and their parents can get in trouble. So students in the K-12 system, at least up into when they can drop out, have very little say and henceforth very little self-determination as to whether or not they're accessing education. There's not an option there. On the other hand, adult learners very much do have an option as to what or why they're accessing educational opportunities. Oftentimes it's extremely important out of either relevance or need. It could be a vocational skill, it could be a parenting or house management skill, or it could be an independent skill in some way that's going to improve or better the quality of their life in some way. Also, as such, adult learners are going to have a higher rate of motivation, as nobody's forcing them to access or go through an educational process as an adult. They're doing it of their own free will and own volition, and ergo, simply the illusion of choice creates a more highly motivated learner. So for a adult learner we don't have to worry about the illusion of choice. They're making a choice of their own free will. Choice is going to inherently cause motivation because they have the conscious decision of either A, accessing and engaging with an educational opportunity, or B, not engaging, and that's completely up to them to be able to make that decision. As such, adult learners have certain needs that youth learners may or may not. For example, we talk about in classroom management for our undergrads all the time about how do we keep learning relevant? How do we make learning interesting to our young students? This has a lot to do with motivation and self-determination. That's the proverbial algebra class. When am I ever going to use this? In andragogic theory, this is very much not the case, because adult learners seek education because they need it. They need that job training skill. They need that, it could be a parenting class. It could be anything. They either need it or they want it. And what they want out of it is they want to get immediate use and immediate return. They want to learn something today so that they can use it tomorrow, because that's the whole reason why they're accessing the educational opportunity in the first place, is to learn something, either knowledge, skill, or perspective. They're going to learn it now to be able to immediately use it tomorrow. Also, specifically related to adult learners has to do with this idea of distributed versus distance education. One of the things that Knowles talks about, and is a big part of adult education theory, has to do with the barriers to access for adults. For adults, many of them manage families, they manage other jobs, they manage other sorts of responsibilities within their community. Also, there are other socioeconomic factors that can prohibit an adult learner's ability to access an educational opportunity, whether it's Wi-Fi access, ability to travel, the human resources they have in running their household. There are many things that can prevent an adult learner from accessing a specific educational opportunity. As such, both distance and distributed learning provide opportunities for adult learners to be able to learn within an environment and within a time frame that is more accessible to that particular person. A person that may not be able to come to class on a Tuesday from 6:30 to 9 could absolutely find some time, theoretically, throughout the week to put in those 2.5 hours at the computer, either after dinner, after the kids go to bed, after work, between shifts, or whatever, to access that same learning that an on-campus or a traditional student or a youth student would access through what we would consider the typical means of going to class on an on-campus traditional type of method. Lastly, what makes adult learners unique is the fact that they have a huge scope of life experiences, especially if you compare it to the life experiences of a child. And this is simple mathematics. If you have someone who's 15 years old and you have someone who's 45 years old, the 45-year-old is going to have, roughly 3 times the amount of life experience as the 15-year-old, because they've lived 3 times as long. Now, that's not a hard and fast number, but hopefully you understand what I'm trying to go with, that people who are older develop wider and deeper experience bases. This is one thing that Knowles, along with Jared Apps and quite a few of the other adult education theorists say when we're trying to reach adult educators, is that we need to activate those life experiences. We need to use them in the educational environment to be able to help that adult learner either understand a perspective, find a relative, either a situation so that they can scaffold the new information onto, or we could potentially pull up a specific situation where they can reevaluate that so that they can either affirm their beliefs or they can potentially modify their beliefs based on new stimulus that comes into their mental model of whatever a topic, a situation, or whatever it is. So, what is the role of the teacher, specifically in the context of teaching adults, specifically in the context of teaching adults in distance environments? First is my personal belief that teachers of adults need to be facilitators of learning. One of the things that we learn as undergrads is our different power bases. To which can we claim power and authority over our classroom? In many K-12 situations, teachers can take a liberatory power base, whereas they are in the front, they are the provider of information, and it somewhat funnels into their students. Also to the same end, K-12 teachers very much operate on an authoritarian power base. This is where discipline, classroom management, and effective behavior control comes into play, whereas they need to maintain a specific environment, and sometimes they need to use their power base of an authority figure to be able to do so. Some of the unique contexts of adult learners is that, once again, adult learners are highly motivated. They're self-determined, they're there of their own free will and volition. So we don't necessarily need to act as a classroom manager or a behavior police or anything like that. What we want to do is we want to facilitate that adult in accessing previous experiences, helping them pull up their own mental models of specific topics, concepts, or what have you, and evaluate them and analyze them through reflection of their own experiences, introduction of supporting materials, also collaboration of other people's diverse experiences, so that adult learner can either affirm or potentially change or modify their perspective, understanding, knowledge of a specific topic. As such, adult education, to me, is a very constructivist model of education. Whereas we have our three models, behaviorism, cognitivism, and constructivism. As we've said to this point, adults have a wider experience base, so they have a wider range of experiences to draw on if we're going to teach in a constructivist type of way, because really constructivism is how does a person interact with their environment and their experiences. It's within the context of the specific learner. So if that specific learner has a wide base of experiences which to contextualize, that's where we can use this constructivist learning theory to try to access those specific experiences, provide some context or perspective on them, introduce new information based on those perspectives that have already been either activated or established by the student, and then that person can then make their own decision as an adult, once again to either affirm or to potentially modify their beliefs on something specific. So, what are the responsibilities of adult educators? We talked about the role of a teacher, but what are our responsibilities, especially in the context of distance education? The first thing is to provide active learning. The teaching and learning text speaks a ton about the idea of creating active learning, and that's also something that's very congruent with constructivist learning theory, that we need active experiences. The more passive the learning experience, the less that we can base it on a specific experience. Active learners are engaged learners. Active learners are accessing their life perspectives and their life experiences to evaluate, to question, to affirm, or to modify. Next, we need to provide effective communication. This is especially true in distance environments. It's one of the main things that the text talks about. The difference between face-to-face and distance is that the student does not get the experience of having face-to-face interaction with the instructor. As such, the instructor needs to help bridge that gap to facilitate both effective and available communication to the specific student. That means they need to make themselves accessible if the student needs help. They need to be able to respond in effective time frames and potentially use a variety of media and technology in order to respond. And the book talks quite a bit about that between one-way, two-way communication, audio, video, among other things, that the teacher needs to be able to effectively communicate with their students. And if they don't have the opportunity to meet face-to-face and to ask questions in person, it is the responsibility of that instructor to kind of bridge that gap to make sure that the student has the feedback that they need to help either correct issues that they have, to gain clarification or perspective on a specific issue, and so forth. Next, it's the responsibility of adult educator to provide a range of materials. And this isn't something that's contextually relevant to just distance education or to just adult education. This is education in general. This is something that I teach in my undergrad class on differentiation and special education. Using a range of different materials, hence differentiation, means that we are going to hit and activate a variety of learning styles. Make sure that we can provide auditory input, we can provide visual stimulus, we can provide, if possible, some sort of hands-on or at least some sort of active application activity. The wider range of learning styles that we can hit as a teacher, the more likelihood that one or more of those is going to reach and click, if you will, with a specific student's learning style. So that's going to ultimately optimize the learning outcomes of the maximum amount of students possible. And then last, a teacher needs to understand the environment and the context of the learners in which they're teaching. This is compounded because, as we stated above, we don't have face-to-face interaction with our students. So at times, a distance educator is going to need to take extra steps to be able to facilitate the understanding of the context of their students, whether that be through online interaction, and it could be either audio, video interaction, or it could be through surveying, it could be through pre-testing. There's a number of ways. But before we really want to get into the main content of a course, we need to understand the context of the audience in which the course is being provided to. And we can use that information to make real-time decisions, to make potential adjustments to our course in real time, to better facilitate that specific instruction and that specific material to the specific audience. And that may vary from one class to one class. And per Tomlinson, who's one of the gurus of differentiated instruction, this is not mutually exclusive, and you can provide the same objectives across 4 or 5 different sections of the same class, even if you provide slightly different learning activities to each of those classes, or you teach in a slightly different way to each of those classes. You can still meet all of the course objectives, but just in slightly different ways based on the needs of that specific group of people. Next, what are some theoretical principles of instructional design that we have talked about in this class and in some other classes in the EdTech program? The first question we need to ask ourselves when developing a course is, what kind of course are we trying to develop? One of the major differences that the book talks about teaching and learning is the difference between a distance class and a distributed class. And the simplest way that I can The first question we need to ask ourselves during this instructional design process is, what kind of course are we developing? One of the main issues that the book talks about in teaching and learning is the difference between a distance class and a distributed class. And the simplest way that I can reduce this information is that distance and distributed are trying to solve 2 issues when it comes to barriers to access to education. A distance education class, think of distance as length. A distance education class utilizes technology to overcome geographical barriers. A person who lives in a rural area that may not be able to commute to a big city or to a city that contains a campus that offers the education of their choice can have that geographical barrier overcome by enrolling on an online distance program where they're going to get an equivalent education to the in-class or the face-to-face model of the courses, but just through an online vehicle. A distributed learning environment is one that overcomes the barriers of both geography and time. One of the barriers to access for adult educators has to do with their level of adult responsibility, job, family, other sorts of professional obligations. That can be an additional barrier to access on top of the barrier of geography that's addressed in distance education. Whereas distributed education hopes to achieve a solution to a broader problem and a broader barrier to access of both geography and time. That leads me to my second point of what kind of course are we going to develop. Is our course going to be synchronous or asynchronous? A synchronous course being where we have some sort of group or collaborative meeting time where we have face-to-face interaction in a class, remote class type of environment, where asynchronous allows a student to move either at their own pace or within a much broader or wider context of where they have more autonomy over their scheduling and over their management of when and how are they going to interact with the course material. So both synchronous and asynchronous course models answer two different problems with two different types of solutions. Last, we need to ask ourselves, at what level are we trying to teach this class? Is this going to be an introductory class? Is this going to be a application or a methods class where we use basic information that we've learned in some sort of context or in some sort of application? Is this class going to be a capstone or an independent study? We need to ask ourselves, at what level are we trying to teach this class? Because that's going to affect the level at which we design our content. An introductory class is going to have a broad scope of information. So that will be a lot of things at a relatively shallow level. More advanced classes could still be a relatively broad scope, but could also be a much more narrower and specialized scope that goes much, much deeper down into the whole of literature and theory in that specific specialty area. So we need to ask ourselves, at what level are we teaching the course, so that we can determine what is going to be our scope, what is going to be our depth. Both of those are extremely important, not just in distance education, but in all instructional design and in all teaching. So what are some specific considerations that we need to take into account when we're designing distance and distributed classes? First are our considerations that we need to make as teachers, either pedagogues or andragogues, whether we're teaching children or adults. The first thing is why is this information being accessed? Once again, specifically in the context of andragogy, which is what my course in my philosophy is based on, we need to understand, why are these adults seeking out my services as an educator? What do they want to do? Are they trying to learn something new? Are they trying to refine their skills? What is it precisely that the learner wants to get out of this specific learning experience? Because we can use that information to help facilitate those needs to that specific student. Next, especially with adult learners, we need to assess and learn the context of our learners and our class environment so that we can determine if there's either scheduling or other sort of resource or access barriers. What are going to be things that are going to prevent our learners from accessing our materials, or what's going to prevent them from being successful in our course? Now, maybe there's something that we can do about it, and maybe there isn't. It's really on a case-by-case basis. But we need to take the time, especially at the beginning of a course, to learn about our students, and only through increased awareness and knowledge of our students can we really make an informed decision as to what are some specific issues that maybe we can potentially address in our instructional design during the initial parts of the class to help better facilitate people that may either have time-related access issues or other sorts of access issues related to access to digital content through lack of internet or other sorts of salient considerations for what could potentially prevent an adult from accessing the education. The third thing that a teacher needs to consider is at what level are our students and what kind of prior knowledge do our students possess when they enter our class. This is going to go a long way because it's going to help us, first of all, understand what is prior knowledge that can be activated during the beginning phases of a new unit or module or topic. Or we can identify trends of holes in either that particular student or group of students' information base, awareness base, or whatever it is that we're trying to achieve through this educational activity. So we can identify those holes and make sure that we're spending extra time during the instructional process to emphasize those specific topics to help fill in those gaps or those holes in that person's awareness, skill set, theory base, or whatever it is that's relevant at that time. Last, as a teacher, we need to consider what is going to be the philosophy of our class. Are we going to have a student-centered class or a teacher-centered class? And this goes back to the idea of the power base, the liberatory versus the facilitative teacher. A liberatory teacher is a very teacher-centered practitioner, whereas they have their understanding and their concept, their framework of whatever it is that they're trying to teach, and they're trying to transfer that specific framework to their students. Now, a student-centered teacher is trying to help the student develop their own framework. They're trying to help, they're trying to allow growth, and they're trying to allow the student to create their own framework and their own development. And you can use effective questioning, you can use the introduction of literature and resources, but you want to be an effective questioner and you want to be a facilitator for students to be able to make those connections on their own. So to what extent are both of these effective? Well, they certainly can both be effective if used properly. There are certain, especially in learning basics and introduction to specific topics, oftentimes there are specific processes that need to be followed step by step or verbatim, because that's just the nature of certain skills, especially mathematical skills or other sorts of very process-oriented educational or technical or real life experiences. Oftentimes you need to follow a strict set of protocols or things that are really not open to interpretation. In that sense, a teacher-centered lesson or even a module or even unit could potentially be appropriate because we're trying to establish that baseline understanding of a theoretically accepted process that everybody kind of needs to know before they can move on and move forward. Whereas a student-centered approach, especially when we get higher up into intermediate and advanced applications of topics, where we want students to be able to develop their own framework, just for students to be able to make their own connections so that they can develop their own models. So what sort of organizational considerations do we need to make when we're designing distance ed? Well, Teaching and Learning Chapter 5 speaks a lot about this. So the first thing that we want to ask ourselves is, what model are we going to be using to organize our information? Are we going to use a linear model, whereas you need to know number 1 before you know number 2, and you need to do number 2 before you do number 3, and that's just how it needs to be. That very much aligns with this idea of teacher-centered learning, whereas in a more liberatory fashion, the teacher is providing the framework in which they believe that information needs to be acquired. We can also potentially use somewhat of a modification of a linear model or branch model, whereas there's still somewhat of a looser sequence, a linear sequence, but instead of 1, 2, 3 as far as steps, we can consider them tiers, where there's a certain tier of information in Tier 1 that a student needs to be able to understand before they move on to Tier 2. Now, Tier 1 can contain 10 different concepts, of which the student could potentially interact with those concepts in any order. It may not matter depending on the context of what it is that we're trying to teach. But that student needs to understand these 10 or however many basic concepts to a certain level before they move on to Tier 2, which could potentially be application of those, or it could be more advanced versions of the basic concepts, or what have you. Or we could potentially use things like web content or media-heavy instructional design models, whereas we're using things like video, interactive media, through using things like Flash or things like that, so that a student has an opportunity to interact with a specific thing. And this is especially good in distance environments because, going to the SAMR model, what we don't want to do is use what we have, the equivalent of a Ferrari, and we don't want to start our Ferrari with a coat hanger, as it were, where we have the capability of providing all of these ways to revolutionize or to modify a specific learning content. But in many cases, you can see LMSs or online classes stuck at the S or the substitution level, whereas they're really just, instead of having photocopies of pages, you now have scanned PDFs of pages, and they're using the LMS as a digital repository of static resources. Ideally, we would like to go beyond the static resources and create dynamic and interactive resources, and that's where the hypercontent very much comes into play. Also, we could potentially use a self-directed model. Now, this is specifically an advanced model, and it's not necessarily good for all learners. First of all, learners need to have a certain base level of information to be able to direct their own learning. Secondly, students need to have a certain level of motivation and a certain level of self-regulation of their learning and time management to be able to make sure that everything is going and being completed within the context and time frame of the constraint of the class. So self-direction is not for everyone, but it can definitely be good for someone. And then lastly, one of the main ideas that we've learned in Chapter 5, which is the idea of unit model topic, whereas a main instructional design organizational theory, whereas we take a macro issue and then we break it down into more micro levels, whereas our unit is the most macro topic, and we can break it down into mid-level topics, which are our modules, and then the most micro level, which are specific topics, which fit inside a specific module, which all fit inside a unit, which fit inside a course. The last consideration as far as our organization of our content is our course going to be either delivered through a learning management system, or is it going to be through one of the online open courses? And this is specific because the last thing we need to consider in the organization of our course is this going to be an open course or a closed course? And I use the term LMS to denote a closed course, as it's going to be through a school or an institution's learning management system, whereas a MOOC, or basically an online open course, is going to be openly available to the public. So we need to determine what is going to be the end goal and who is the target audience. Are we creating this content for a specific group of people? If so, we're going to have issues such as availability of information. It's only going to be available to the people enrolled in the specific course through the timeline through which they're enrolled in the course. Whereas the online open course is available all the time to everybody. So that can potentially affect the types of content and the types of resources that we use. And it can also go into the topic of intellectual property, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, whereas a lot of institutions, most institutions own the intellectual property of their courses that their instructors create, and will not allow that to be freely distributed, because if that information was freely distributed, that would take the financial incentive away for people to pay to take the specific class. So that's a pretty specific consideration that we may have to make as far as how are we organizing this class. What is the availability of the material? Next, what are some design considerations? Now, not that teaching and learning has excellent resources as to how do we design online courses, but I really learned a lot and took a lot away from Morrison's Designing Effective Instruction, which is the textbook for EdTech 660. So I'm actually using some information from that book to answer this specific question. So what are some design considerations? Well, the first thing are what are some pre-instruction considerations that we need to make? We need to clearly define our course. So we need to have a clear syllabus. We need to have a clear understanding of our students and where they are in their specific levels of knowledge for a specific topic, for a specific content. So pre-testing is incredibly important because you can help yourself gain that understanding by measuring specific objectives, specific pieces of content to better understand where students are. And as we previously noted, you can use that information to either understand that students have a good grasp on specific topics so that you can better use them as activators of prior knowledge, or you can identify holes in understanding that you can use and you can provide a little bit of extra resource to help bridge those gaps during direct instruction. Next, it's important that we develop an advanced organizer for our class. It's basically creating a visual framework for the content in our class, and that's going to help us determine how we're going to organize our class, whether it be a web, whether it be a line, or whatever it is that we're going to do. So we're going to categorize the content into specific tiers, into a specific sequence, or whatever is going to be most appropriate for the context of whatever it is that we're trying to teach at that particular moment. And creating that advanced organizer is going to go a long way to help, once again, answer that question in our organizational considerations, which is, what kind of class am I developing? So these very much go together, design and organization. Next, the development of a course. We need to understand and consider what's going to be our pacing. How fast are we going to go? How much material are we going to cover in a specific amount of time? How are we going to sequence the material? What needs to come first, second, third? What's going to be our step sizes? How are we going to go from basic to intermediate to advanced? How quickly? How are we going to stop and check for understanding before we move on to the next step? And lastly, the gradual release of responsibility. That's not necessarily from the Morrison text, but it was something that I learned in an undergrad in several of my methods classes, so I can't cite it to a specific thing. But general release of responsibility, which is to what extent is the teacher going to make the locus of control for a specific topic from the teacher providing information to the student understanding the information. And gradually the teacher is going to lower their level of prompting, and the student is going to become more independent in their ability to interact with a piece of content. Next, an important design consideration is evaluation. That's going to involve both formative and summative evaluation during instruction and after instruction. It's also going to involve the pretest, although we've already mentioned that in an earlier subtopic. Also, the idea of student self-assessment. This is good for understanding of a student's own metacognition. What do students think they understand? What do students actually understand? Is that the same? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. If there's a big difference between what students think they understand and what students ultimately end up understanding, that's a discrepancy that we need to look at and we need to analyze. How can we address that? Is there something that we did that was or caused that gap between what students think they know and what students actually know, and how can we facilitate that? And then lastly, we need to understand the context of what we are designing and for who are we designing it for. So we need to have an analysis of not only the learners but also the content, which we've already discussed in previous slides, but we need to know what makes the learners tick, at what levels are they at, and we need to understand the context of the content that we're teaching. Is it basic, intermediate, advanced? What is the purpose? At what level? At what scope? At what depth? We need to answer all those questions. A couple more special considerations for design elements in instructional design is this idea of what specific ID model is going to fit my specific philosophy of my content. So what's going to be the best way of delivering this? Do we need a linear model? Do we need to learn things step 1, step 2, step 3? For certain process-oriented things, yes, we probably do. For certain more abstract or conceptual things, or for certain things that we may have specific tiers of knowledge, no, we may need to know a bunch of basic things in order to use all of those things and create connections between those things in some sort of intermediate application. So in that respect, we can provide more of a branched or a tier type of a system. So it really depends, once again, on the context of the learner, on the context of the topics. Secondly, when we're designing, we need to understand what is the relationship between the instructor and the specific material. And we've touched on this a little bit already, but we need to understand what is the role of intellectual property, who owns property, to what extent are we using other people's property. This gets into the idea of copyright and fair use. We can't, the distribution of copyrighted materials can be problematic. Although we do have, the fair use of copyrighted materials that we can use if we use it properly. So we need to address those on case-by-case basis so that we can make better decisions and make sure that we're not getting ourselves into any trouble with copyright infringement or theft of intellectual property, because we don't want to do that. Last, we want to ask ourselves, what is going to be our instructional archetype of this specific design model? What sort of cognitive processes are we trying to activate? Are we trying to activate behavioral, cognitivist, or constructivist types of thought processes? What's best? Is there a best? I'm not so sure. I think all three, when used within a proper context of proper content, can all be best in their own situations. Behaviorist, which is being able to, task completion. If a person's trying to learn a specific process and you need to do A, B, C, there's really no room for interpretation. For example, nursing, how to take blood, how to give CPR, things where you really can't improvise and you really need to do every step properly. Otherwise, you're going to get an undesired or potentially bad or destructive or harmful result. So in that respect, if we're trying to teach a specific process, the behaviorist model will absolutely be appropriate because there's only one right way, and that's the right way, and that's the way that we're teaching it. Or you could potentially be teaching more cognitivist, where we're trying to take specific topics and create hierarchies, create organization, right? Create tiers of understanding. And it's where we use our higher order thinking principles of elaboration and organization to be able to take basic information that we know and use them to create new connections with other information. Or we can use constructivist theory, where we're going to use a person's life experience and a person's individual context of their own existence to help create connections based on their life experiences to either new information or to get them to either affirm or to potentially modify existing experience or existing perceptions of their experiences based on other people's experiences, new information, or otherwise. So this is more personal, reflective, and very active model. So to each used properly can be the best for each specific situation, but it really depends on the specific content. Last, what are some technical considerations that we need to address when we're doing distance education? Well, we have quite a few. And we've already talked about communication. So how do we communicate between teacher and student? And how do we communicate between student and student? Well, we have a few ways of doing that. Like it says in teaching and learning, we have both one and two-way communication. You can have live communication. You can also have remote communication, where a teacher can, more in a one-way facet, where a teacher can provide feedback in the form of audio, video, a screencast, or otherwise to provide good, effective, systematic feedback. Or you can have two-way communication where people get on either end of a Skype call or a Zoom conference and we can talk, which is the most like a face-to-face which is good in some instances, but in other instances, especially for learners which have time-related barriers to their access, that may not always be feasible because your schedule and your student's schedule, it may be very hard to try to achieve that. So you may need to supplement that with intermittent one-way back and forth communication. But it doesn't just have to be through email. It can be through a screencast. It could be through an audio recording. It can be through any means of technology that can record information and send it to another person. There is really no one best. It's just whatever is best in the specific context of what that student needs. Also, another consideration is to what extent is our learner going to have barriers to access when it comes to this idea of the digital divide? To what extent may a learner have access issues to potentially a computer as opposed to a tablet? Maybe some things that we do are going to be PC only, or maybe, for example, for Ball State, for many years it was Mac only, and that was a big issue for a lot of students that I taught, and when I was a student worked with, that the purchase price of a Mac was in many cases a barrier, or at least a hardship, towards access to the technology that Teachers College was providing, because even the cheapest Mac was about plus or minus $1,000, where you can go get a Dell for $300 or $400. So that's a big disparity in cost, and cost can absolutely be a barrier to access. So when we're choosing instructional activities, we need to think about the usability and what are going to be the technology requirements for that specific activity, and could that potentially lead to having a barrier to access for people that don't have that level or tier of technology. And if they do, are there alternatives that we could potentially do to help that person fully participate? Lastly, what kind of tools can we potentially use? So how are we going to utilize the different resources that are available out there in the online environment? What are best? There is no one best for all situations. For every specific situation, there may not even be one best. There could be many good. Some may have a best, some may not. Blogs, wikis, video content creation, visual advanced organizers, data visualization, infographics, all those things can all potentially be used. And given the right circumstances and the right context, all of those can be used to great effect. But we don't want to, sometimes I call it the spaghetti model, where people kind of get over exuberant about the idea of using tech, and they throw the spaghetti against the wall to see what sticks. And we're going to use everything, but it's not properly or specifically placed and targeted to try to achieve a specific end. So it becomes, we have a usability issue, where is it relevant to the specific assignment, and to what extent does the use of this technology enhance the learning environment? If it doesn't, we need to reconsider the use of the specific technology in the specific context. Technology is good. Any specific instructional strategy used improperly or without proper thought is not good. Also, as a secondary consideration, to what extent do we need training? That's not just for the students. Do we need to be trained on things? Do the students need to be trained on things? We don't want to have a student have to interact with a piece of technology and then assess them based on a product that they make from that technology if that student can't properly interact with that piece of technology. Now, you can kind of take that in two different directions. If the objective of the class is for a student to learn how to interact with a piece of technology, when we're assessing that particular assignment, part of the thing that we're assessing is how well and at what proficiency is the learner using that piece of technology. If it's good, they get their points. If if they didn't do a couple things right, then they lose points. Now, on the other hand of that, if the objective of the course, or if the broader objective isn't to learn how to use a piece of technology, we need to make sure that we're providing the adequate training and that students are adequately comfortable using that said piece of technology. Because if we give a student an assignment and say, use this particular tool, and the purpose of the assignment wasn't to use that tool, but was to synthesize a certain piece of learning or information or whatever, and they have a hard time interacting with the tool, that's going to prevent that student's ability to be able to fully demonstrate their understanding or knowledge of that course material that we have asked that student to synthesize for us. And it's not for a lack of understanding of the course material, it's for a lack of understanding of how to use the instructional tool properly. So what we're going to see is we could potentially see this performance gap between people. Two people are going to have equal understanding of the course material. One person can use the technology well, the other person does not use the technology well. The person who uses the technology well will get a better score than the other person, not because of anything from a curricular goal or objective in the class, but because of a subsidiary use of technology that they weren't properly trained on how to use. And this comes up a lot in special education when we're talking about performance gaps for students with learning disabilities or other disabilities. So it's something that we talk about in our little part of the world all the time. So in summation, what's the ultimate answer to this question? Can we develop an online course that is as effective as an in-person course? Well, in short, it depends. Both yes and no. Absolutely, we potentially could if certain criteria and conditions can be met. First thing is we need to understand at what level are students responsible for themselves and for their learning. This goes back to the idea of andragogy, where students who are highly motivated and who are also self-directed to access that specific educational opportunity are going to have a higher success rate because they're going to have higher discipline, or more discipline. They're going to be more likely to want to and commit to participating fully and getting everything that they can out of the class, because they're doing this not because they have to, or they're going to be cut off from their parents, but they want to actually learn something that's going to benefit their life. So it really depends. If you give a self-directed class to a student that's not very highly motivated, we're setting ourselves up for a situation where that student could potentially put things off and then kind of slam through things and cut corners and shortcut, and ultimately they're not going to get the educational experience that they could have. And we don't have the self-monitoring of having a student come to our class every week or a couple times a week, and we can talk to them, we can check in, and we can't get that step-by-step feedback because we don't have that face-to-face interaction, and it's harder to check up on someone if you don't see them 5 feet in front of your face twice a week. It's much harder to check up and make sure that people are following and doing what they need to do. So it really depends on the level of student responsibility and student motivation. Also, secondly, to what extent is feedback required, and to what extent can we provide feedback? This really depends on the specific scope or the specific subject matter of online or distance content. For some things, especially more basic or more factually oriented things, or more process oriented things, we can analyze and we can identify a specific process, and it's through a process of memorization and more maintenance rehearsal level learning that student learns specific topics. Now, for more advanced things that are specifically going to need to provide certain phases of feedback, where it may be hard for us to go back in and do error analysis if a student gives us a either partially or fully completed project and we can't see the specific steps that the student went through, it's going to be hard for us to identify the specific areas where that student went wrong and specifically when, and we have a waste of resources because instead of being able to stop that student midway, let's stop and look over things, let's review things, and then go back. That student has had to then complete, and then go back and delete, and then go back and redo specific things that they haven't done. So it could potentially be a time and cost efficiency issue there. Now, that being said, you can do a lot to help facilitate systematic feedback for even very advanced and intense types of topics, but that's going to require a lot of resources on the part of the instructor to maintain that level of communication and maintain that level of feedback. Third, to what extent do students need to interact with each other in order to successfully complete or gain or learn the specific things that they're trying to get out of the educational experience? If they need a high amount of collaboration or teamwork working together, we, as we talked about in the second point, need to do a lot more front-end work to be able to facilitate that for people that may not have the skills in or the awareness on working in online environments, may not utilize the online environments to their full extent and not provide enough opportunities for students to work with each other, and especially for more collaborative types of learning topics and environments. That's going to ultimately degrade the quality of the overall experience if you don't get to actually utilize and apply what you're learning about collaboration, or the idea that you are supposed to be working together. When that actually gets put into practice in the course, if we don't provide the proper resources for them to be able to facilitate that, then we're not going to meet the specific end that we would have liked to, as opposed to having kids that are in a room, or adults that are in a room for an hour and a half twice a week, that we know that there's going to be time for group work, conversation, discussion, reflection, etc. And then lastly, to what extent is the teacher prepared, and to what extent does the teacher have the skills to provide distance education? And this isn't about the digital divide, but this has a lot to do with digital nativism. I've grown up with the internet. I've had it since I was 8 years old, dial-up. I remember what it's like without the internet, but I've also lived pretty much my entire academic life with the internet. Not only just internet, but also broadband internet. So I don't remember what it's like to go to school without the internet, going to school at any level of proficiency beyond coloring and learning your ABCs. So I have a considerable amount of experience working within digital environments. As a student, I kind of remember what works and what doesn't work, and I've used this as I've gone through and looked at the content in this course and in other courses in the EdTech program to kind of either affirm or change some of my perceptions regarding the use of online or distance education formats for the delivery of instruction. Now, some teachers may not have that same experience base that I have. Some teachers may have taken this much later in life. Some teachers may not have had the motivation or the volition to want to learn the new or emerging technology. Some teachers may not have bought in to some of the theories and concepts that we've been learning in this program. For those people, they're going to be much less likely to be able to provide an educational experience that is on parity with the experience that they can provide in a face-to-face class. That doesn't necessarily make them a bad teacher. It just means that their specific teaching style is more conducive to the face-to-face model as opposed to a distance model, and it has to do with their skill set and their experience set. So it really depends on quite a few factors. So in conclusion, is it possible for me personally to develop an online course that is on parity with the face-to-face courses that I teach? I certainly believe so. Both as a student and as a teacher, I've had a considerable amount of experience working with online environments, especially learning from this class and some other classes in instructional design. I've reaffirmed my initial beliefs on the importance of things like interaction and collaboration, the idea of proper sequencing, proper steps, the ability of student choice, and several other salient issues in the field of instructional design. And I've also have a lot of experience and have logged countless hours in online environments. So as a user, I have my own opinions and perceptions of what I believe works and what doesn't work. And as a provider of those services, it's really one of my existential ends that I want to provide the type of online and distance environment that I would want to have as a student, which is one that is engaged, one where students work with each other, one where students can share experiences with each other, and one where students can learn and grow together, and one that's not a faceless experience, one where they're going to have access to me, one where I can give systematic feedback, where I can create a YouTube video rather than writing 2 sentences on the review of a specific product. I can go in and screencast my review of a specific product and go through and highlight specific things and point specific things and I can go back into the programs that they're using and say, okay, you can improve here, here, and here, and to provide that extra layer of information to help bridge that gap between my face-to-face classes and my online classes. Because in my face-to-face classes, if my student's making an iBook, I can sit down with them and say, let's go into iBooks Author together and I'll show you all these things. In distance environments, it's a little bit more difficult because the student would have to, first of all, address their concerns through email, and they may not provide me enough information to properly articulate their problem. So it may take a couple of extra steps to go back and forth, but then ultimately I can show them through screencast or through a Skype screen share or something like that. I can go in and I can show them, and I can help replicate that in-class feel and that in-class environment through a distance platform. And one of the reoccurring themes I think that's come through this belief statement is the concept of effort. To provide efficient distance learning is going to take a lot of effort, and the good from the bad is really defined by the amount of effort that the instructor puts in. It's very easy for a low effort instructor to provide distance education, but are they providing an interactive experience, or are they providing a S-level SAMR model correspondence class, whereas the LMS is nothing more than a digital repository for static resources? That's not the online environment that I want to create. I want to create a dynamic environment where people talk to each other, people get on video chat with each other, people can get on video chat with me, to help replicate or replace the lack of the face-to-face interaction with other types of digital multimedia interaction. And that's absolutely possible. And as the future continues to develop, technology is only going to make that easier, and it's also going to become much more time and cost efficient under the resource perspective. So, is it possible? It depends on the person. Do I think it's possible for myself? Yes, absolutely. So thank you very much for listening to my position statement. I hope that I have adequately described my feelings and thoughts and how they tie to what we've learned, not only in this class, but across the EdTech program in general. Thank you.